All right. Hey there, everyone. Welcome. Glad you can make it. Good morning, Carson. Question today, favorite superhero? Iron Man taking an early lead, it looks like there in the chat. But we also got some love for Batman, which is good. I think that would ultimately be my pick. It's like I like the Marvel stuff as a whole better, probably. But Batman kind of always stands out there as being top tier. Good, good. More love for Iron Man. Excellent. Uh, Feel free to share other picks. Uh, nice, Carson going with Edna mode. Uh, Cyborg, also a good one. Today we're going to kind of do things a little bit differently. Normally we kind of focus on a specific topic or category of historical development. Today we're going to really kind of focus on just 1 year in U.S. history. Because as you will see, quite a lot happens in the year 1968. And so as we're going through today's Class Connect, I want you to try to imagine living through this year and imagining, everything we're going to talk about today, happening within 1 year, living in the United States. I think that might kind of help you better kind of appreciate kind of the impact that the year 1968 had on Americans. We don't have a whole lot of new vocabulary for today. Black Panther Party is really going to be kind of the only new vocabulary. But as you're jotting that down, two things here to note. Again, number one, please make sure if you have missing assignments in U.S. history that you are working on getting those turned in. You don't have a whole lot of time left. Next Friday, March 31st, is the last day to turn in missing work from units 3 and 4. The other thing to note is make sure to double check your Class Connect schedule today. Some of you have been invited to a help session that's kind of related to the wrapping up of the grading period. So if that is on your schedule, please make sure you do attend that you don't have, you don't end up getting an unexcused absence for missing it. As far as when is spring break, it is all of next week. So Monday through Friday of next week, we have off. So it would start the 27th if you wanted to be technical, but basically all of next week. And then real quickly, all right, awesome. Student question for today. How long do historians estimate the first settlers arrived on what is now American soil? It's a good question. It kind of depends on what we mean when we say the first settlers. That may mean different things to different people. If we're just talking about, the very first human beings to kind of set foot on, what is today the United States, we would have to go and look at the migration of early Americans or early humans that ultimately, became the first Native Americans. So ongoing area of historical study, but we estimate that approximately 25,000 years ago, early humans crossed what would have been a land bridge at the time from Asia over into North America, crossing into what is today Alaska. So somewhere approximately 25,000 years ago is probably when the first human being stepped foot on what today we would recognize as being part of the United States. If you are, however, asking when did the first Europeans first arrive in what is today the United States, that would actually be the Vikings. The Vikings were conducting naval expeditions in the late 900s, early 1000s, which would have included them stepping foot on North America. But ultimately, the Vikings didn't stick around. their settlements did not last. They packed things up and came back home. And so if you are then asking the question of, what ends up being the first permanent settlement in the United States that is still around to this day, that would be St. Augustine, which was set up by the Spanish in 1565. That is the earliest European settlement, that still has people living there today. As St. Augustine has continued to grow and develop as a city in Florida, located right here. So those would be the various answers to that question, depending on what you were interested in knowing. But all right, let's go ahead and start getting into 1968. So, last unit, we talked about the civil rights movement and the successes of the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, big achievements. But that did not magically fix all of the ongoing, racial discrimination that existed in the United States. It's not like after 1965, Martin Luther King, wiped his hands and said, okay, job's done. I'm retiring. I'm going home. There was still a lot of work to do. The movement continued. And so in the second half of the 60s, Martin Luther King increasingly focusing more on racial discrimination happening in northern states, which is often a part of the civil rights movement that doesn't get as much attention. We spend all this time talking about the Birmingham campaign and the bus boycotts and all that stuff, but the reality was that there was also racial discrimination in the North, such as in regards to housing. Because thinking back what we've previously discussed, why might African Americans not have had a fair access to housing in the North? Do you recall anything we've looked at that might help explain why things might have been more difficult or unfair for African Americans trying to purchase homes, even in northern states and cities? Excellent, Chad. Yeah, and Miles as well. So there were a couple of different things. One is, you had the building up of suburbs, and we have more and more white Americans moving out into the suburbs as what's known as white flight. But oftentimes then, the door was locked behind them, so to speak, because when suburban neighborhoods were created, oftentimes they would create HOA, homeowners association agreements, that would forbid the selling of homes to African Americans in that neighborhood. So obviously that's going to make it hard for African Americans to purchase a home in that neighborhood. As some of you mentioned, also, the building of the interstates oftentimes then served as dividing lines between white and black communities. And that kind of reinforced the message of stay on your side of the line. We also had the practice of redlining, where banks would deny African Americans a home loan, while at the same time granting a loan, to a white American who may have the exact same financial situation. And so that kind of became one of the next big issues that Martin Luther King, was trying to tackle. And so, for example, here he is in the city of Chicago trying to address housing discrimination in Chicago, when he is suddenly attacked by an individual. There's the throwing of stones at Martin Luther King and other civil rights participants. And so Martin Luther King will later kind of comment, shockingly, that he often is going to find um, just as strong of a resistance to his efforts in the North as he experienced in the South. In fact, there are going to be cases where he talks about things really kind of feeling even more dangerous in northern cities compared to his experience in southern cities. Um, as, for example, as he mentions here when he says, in Chicago last year, thousands of vicious white hoodlums with murder in their hearts bombarded Negroes with rocks and bottles because they dared ask to be neighbors. The white backlash told Negroes that there were limits to their progress, that they must expect to remain permanently unequal and permanently poor. The white backlash said Negroes should not confuse improvements with equality. And so we can very much see here that, this struggle was ongoing, and that ultimately there were ongoing frustrations within African American communities in cities throughout the United States. Frustrations that are increasingly turning into acts of rioting. Um, for example, the previous year, 1967, you have a massive riot in the city of Detroit as a result of long-going tensions between the African American community and the law enforcement in the city of Detroit. And so when Detroit police conduct a raid on a bar that was very popular within the African American community, that kind of ends up being the straw that broke the camel's back. And we see widespread rioting throughout different areas of Detroit. And so, in that regard, we're kind of seeing racial tensions escalating in cities across the United States. That's going to be important to keep in mind, that there's kind of this growing tension building. Uh, but then, for our critical thinking challenge today, I want you. We'll kind of read through it together here, but then take some time to kind of think about what is Martin Luther King kind of focusing on here in the speech he gives on February 23rd, 1968. As we kind of read through it, what I would like you to then send me as a private chat message is, how would you summarize King's message here when he says, whenever the government provides opportunities and privileges for white people and rich people, they call it subsidized. When they do it for the Negro and poor people, they call it welfare. The fact is that everybody in this country lives on welfare. Suburbia was built with federally subsidized credit, and highways that take our white brothers out to the suburbs were built with federally subsidized money to the tune of 90%. Everybody is on welfare in this country. The problem is that we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. That's the problem. So take some time to read back through that if you need to. If you have any questions about what any of the words mean that Martin Luther King is using, send me a private chat message. Let me know. I can quickly send you a definition back. But then what I'd like you to send me is, how would you summarize King's message here? And then bonus question, if you have the time, does this connect to or remind you of anything we've talked about in the class, anything you've seen on the news? Just, are there any connections you can make here? So let's take about 5 minutes here. We'll come back at 9:34. And some great responses already. You have a little over a minute left to send me your response if you haven't already. All right. If you're still typing up a response, totally okay. Um, Finish it up because definitely want to hear from you. But let me grab some of the responses I have so far here. A lot of really good observations here. I love it. All right. Uh, so as we can kind of see here with this quote, in the second half of the 1960s, Martin Luther King was increasingly focusing on the economic inequality that existed in the United States. You know, we had dismantled some of the political divisions, you know, of making it easier for African Americans to vote, getting rid of Jim Crow laws, things like that. Uh, but there still remained a significant economic gap divided by race in the United States. And as King kind of indicates here, some sort of assistance would be needed to help close that gap. The metaphor that might kind of help paint this picture is, if we kind of think about the long history of discrimination against African Americans, um, throughout the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, we might compare that to the equivalent of holding a person's hand down on like a hot stove or something like that. Um, and then, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, that would be like pulling the hand off the stove, which is good. We obviously want to get that hand off the stove. But pulling the hand off the hot stove, does that alone fix everything? Are we all good as soon as we pull the hand off the hot stove? Chad's saying no. I agree. Andy also saying no. How come? What might still be an issue even though we've pulled the hand off the hot stove? Right. I mean, that again, that's good. We wanted to pull the hand off the stove. But the hand's probably still severely injured. It's burnt. If we're really going to fix things, we need to provide some treatment to heal this hand to try to get it back, to the same level with the hand that was not put on the hot stove. And so that's kind of what Martin Luther King here is arguing about is the country needs to do a better job of equally providing economic assistance to all Americans. certainly includes African Americans, but he's not really just talking specifically about African Americans. He, for example, also mentions, um, the poor in general not getting the same support um, as maybe other Americans. When he talks about the fact that the building of the suburbs, received a lot of government support, such as with the building of the interstates, um, that ultimately, especially back then, the interstate system was really a system that more benefited white Americans compared to African Americans, because white Americans were more likely to own cars. White Americans were more likely to be able to move out to the suburbs and use the interstate to commute back and forth. The reality in the 1950s, 1960s was African Americans didn't have as much need for the interstate system, because they tended to live more local to where they worked. They more often did not have a car, couldn't use the interstate system in the same way. So shortly after that speech, he gives that speech in February. Martin Luther King, then in April, early April, will be in Memphis, Tennessee, trying to help build support for sanitation workers that were on strike, trying to get a better and more fair job deal. Doing what is very difficult work, and work I certainly wouldn't want to do, kind of managing the city sewer systems. While Martin Luther King was out on his balcony on April 4th of this hotel, he is then shot and killed as a result of those injuries. And so on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is killed. And that is, of course, a tragedy. And it is something Martin Luther King was very much aware was kind of always a possibility with him doing the work that he was doing. Again, remember, back in the 60s, Martin Luther King was the most hated person in America. He constantly received death threats. He had been attacked on multiple occasions. And so the literal day before he was killed, this is the last speech Martin Luther King gave, and it's almost eerie in its prophetic nature when he says, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And so, yeah, as Chad notes, on one hand, this does provide kind of fertile ground for conspiracy theories. What might be important to note is this is by no means the only time Martin Luther King reflected upon and talked about, his potential death. There is this, interesting coincidence that he talks about it literally the day before he was killed, but it's not like it's the only time he talked about it, because that was just a reality for him of doing this work, as he knew, he was putting his life on the line. But then you think, what would be the response within, African American communities across the country, learning the news that Martin Luther King had been killed? What do you think? How might African Americans in 1968 react to the news that Martin Luther King had been shot and killed? Yeah, definitely. Many saw it as a massive blow. Um, Again, while the civil rights movement is made up of thousands and thousands of people, you know Martin Luther King was viewed as being a major leader of that movement. Um, and so they were worried about with losing King as that leader, as that role model. What would that mean for the future? Uh, for many, it's going to feel like a personal loss. Many African Americans, closely followed, news surrounding Martin Luther King. They read or, listened to his speeches. Um, and so that is going to feel like a personal loss to many. Um, and in many cities across America, that grief and that anger at having such a prominent leader being taken away from them um, is going to be too much. Um, and so, tragically, in cities across America, we see riots break out as news of King's death spreads across the country. Uh, which, of course, is unfortunate because that's not what Martin Luther King would have wanted. He always promoted a message of, forceful but peaceful, nonviolent resistance. Um, but at the same time, for many African Americans, again, this is kind of a straw that broke the camel's back of, well, here you had this leader who was, trying to do things peacefully, trying in different ways to work with and cooperate, with white Americans, and you shot him down. And so there is a feeling of anger and kind of hopelessness throughout cities across America. And unfortunately, that turned into rioting and violence, which then turns into more confrontations with law enforcement, which only further, creates a bad relationship there between African American communities and law enforcement. Really kind of contributing to this ongoing cycle we see in U.S. history. Andy, great question. Yes. Martin Luther King's assassin is, quickly discovered, arrested, and charged. This then ties into a bit of Indiana's history. Because on the day that Martin Luther King was killed, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, or Bobby Kennedy, as he was often known, happened to be in Indianapolis. Because remember, as we talked about yesterday, President Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. And so the Democratic Party's nominee for president is kind of up for grabs. So you had a couple of different Democratic politicians running to try to be the Democratic nominee for president, and that included Bobby Kennedy. And so Bobby Kennedy happened to be in Indianapolis on the day of Martin Luther King's death. And ultimately, he has to be the one to let this crowd of people know that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, which, as you can see, included a crowd that was made up of a lot of African Americans. And so there's actually a video recording of this you can quickly do a YouTube search for, Bobby Kennedy Indianapolis speech. And when Kennedy tells the crowd that King is dead, you can just hear really the collective heartbreak of the crowd. But then Kennedy goes on to give some remarks, to give a speech, honoring King and kind of reminding the crowd of, what were Martin Luther King's values, what would he have wanted to see going forward. And so Indianapolis is one of the few larger American cities where we end up not seeing any rioting after King's death. And Bobby Kennedy, in part, is given some credit, for kind of trying to help the community of Indianapolis process its grief in a positive manner, versus it becoming violent. And so, some of you actually last semester, did a project and went to the site where Kennedy gave that speech. But if you ever happen to be in Indianapolis and go to the Martin Luther King Memorial Park, right off here on the side, you can go to the spot where Kennedy gave that speech. And so Bobby Kennedy running for president was generating a lot of hopefulness and enthusiasm within the United States. He had some different views on the Vietnam War compared to Johnson, and so people were positive about that. People were obviously very nostalgic for the previous Kennedy administration, and so they kind of hoped that, Bobby Kennedy becoming president might kind of bring back, some of that optimistic spirit of the early 1960s under John F. Kennedy's presidency. And so there was this growing hope and support around Bobby Kennedy's run for president. But then on June 5th, 1968, just a couple of months after Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy is also assassinated at a hotel in Los Angeles, California. And so within, 3 months, you have, 2 major, assassination that are going to shock the country. Chad, to your question, so Bobby Kennedy is ultimately killed by a man of Palestinian descent, who was upset that Bobby Kennedy supported military support for Israel, ultimately against Palestinians, which is an ongoing situation, still to this day, of how the country of Israel treats native Palestinians within its borders. So that was ultimately his motivation for doing so. And so looking at this newspaper headline, what does it maybe show us or tell us about America in 1968? Yeah, that this, within the decade, you have, 3 just massive assassinations. And, the country really trying to come to terms with that of, kind of just what is happening. You also had the assassination of Malcolm X earlier in the 1960s as well. So there was a lot. It was a lot to process. So with Kennedy's, definitely Miles, and I'm sure many Americans had the same thought of, what's going to be next? What's around the corner? So Kennedy's death only further flames tensions within the Democratic Party of okay, who are we going to run for president at this point? It's not going to be Johnson. We then thought it was going to be Kennedy, but now he's dead. And so when the Democratic Party is heading into its convention, which is kind of when all the leaders of the party come together to decide, who are they going to nominate for president, that was still very much up in the air, with a lot of debate within the Democratic Party. Should we nominate someone who, is going to stick with the Vietnam War? Do we nominate someone who's going to challenge the Vietnam War? And with unfortunate timing, the Democratic Party's convention was going to be held in Chicago of that year. And as we previously saw last semester, Chicago is a city that unfortunately has a long history of police brutality. You may recall back when we studied the Industrial Revolution and the rise of labor unions that Chicago police were often involved in trying to break up labor unions and worker protests. And so, remember, the Vietnam War is still ongoing. So you have people who are planning to show up in Chicago to protest the Vietnam War during the party convention. And so the mayor of Chicago at the time basically gave the green light to Chicago police of do whatever it takes to shut down these protests. And so Chicago police were extremely aggressive in going after the anti-war protesters. Mass arrests were conducted. Violence was used to try to break the protest up. And, all the major news stations were there to cover the party convention. So all of this was filmed and shown on television. And so for Americans across the country watching this, it looks like a war zone. And it's again another one of these events where Americans are going to all be watching the same thing and have very different interpretations. Some people are going to watch it and go, oh my gosh, what are these police doing? This is an abuse of government power. These people should have the right to protest. This is insane. Other people are going to watch it and say, these protesters are out of line. They were told to disperse by the police. They didn't listen to what the police told them to do. So, the police got to do what the police got to do. They should have left when they were told to leave. And so it becomes yet another event that is just further going to divide Americans as they process these events very differently from one another. It is also during this time period that we are seeing the rise of a new branch of the civil rights movement, the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party started in 1966 and kind of will build momentum in 67, 68. And ultimately had a very different approach to, say, Martin Luther King's approach. Much more kind of revolutionary in its methods and messaging. That on one hand included building different community programs within African-American neighborhoods to try to support one another. But in particular, what became a major topic of concern for the Black Panther Party was the long history of police brutality against African-Americans. Because we do have to acknowledge that, when you had segregation laws in effect, those laws were enforced by police. And so it oftentimes meant that, police officers were there to enforce discriminatory treatment towards African Americans. And so the Black Panther Party solution to that was to basically have armed patrols within their own communities to keep an eye on police officers, what the Black Panther Party called cop watching, So basically, members of the Black Panther Party would be there, openly carrying firearms, um, observing and watching whenever police officers would go into black neighborhoods, to investigate or make an arrest. Um, the Black Panthers Party argument was, hey, there's a long history of police officers not treating African Americans fairly. We're just, we want to be there to kind of keep an eye on things and make sure, police officers don't abuse their power. But if you had to take a guess, how might white Americans react, to this imagery of, members of the Black Panther Party, walking around with rifles and shotguns, keeping an eye on police officers? If you put yourself in the time period of the 1960s, yeah, a lot of white Americans are going to have a very negative reaction to the Black Panther Party, kind of viewing them as being usurpers, um, viewing them as being dangerous. Because, in all honesty, most white Americans were not familiar with the image of an African American person walking around with a gun. That just was not something white Americans had really experienced in the past. And so many white Americans are, going to see that and automatically view it as being very threatening. Um, even though African Americans, of course, have an equal right to the Second Amendment, just like any other group of Americans, to own firearms. But that really is going to shock a lot of white Americans, and it's going to make a lot of white Americans uncomfortable. To the point, for example, in California, where you have Republican Governor Ronald Reagan at the time, they will sign the Mulford Act, which outlaws open carry as a response, which was basically a way to kind of try to kneecap the efforts of the Black Panther Party. Oh, you're going to walk around with, shotguns and rifles out in public? We're going to pass a law outlawing open carry as a response. Now you can't do that anymore, or you'll get arrested for that. So we can see that the imagery of the Black Panther Party made a lot of Americans nervous. And within government, so yeah, Chad, I don't fully know the details, not my area of expertise, but I believe would not be able to kind of have them out in public, period. So the FBI, for example, very quickly started putting together operations to try to infiltrate the Black Panther Party, basically try to get people who were working for the FBI within the Black Panther Party to then try to sabotage it from within, by kind of reporting on what is the Black Panther Party doing, having these kind of agents try to cause drama and division within the Black Panther Party. And in particular, what was a major target was the leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, Fred Hampton, who is another complex figure in U.S. history. Because the city of Chicago at that time did have an issue of gang violence. Hampton and the Black Panther Party then worked to reduce that gang violence, kind of recognizing that, that wasn't helping people within the African American community. And so the Black Panther Party organized to try to ease tensions between different gangs within the city of Chicago, and trying to support their community by providing free meals to children, both black and white. But at the same time, Hampton took a very strong stance against local police and kind of pointed the finger at Chicago police for being part of the problem of why there was so much tension and trouble within the city. And that kind of put a target on him. That was not seen as being acceptable by many, criticizing the police. And so after 2 officers were killed in a shootout with members of the Black Panther Party, which Hampton was not there, but because he's the leader of the Black Panther Party, he's kind of viewed as being responsible. Hampton will secretly be drugged by kind of an undercover agent at a Black Panther meeting at Hampton's apartment. And then once Hampton is passed out and unconscious, police will raid his home. And as part of that process, Hampton will be shot twice in the head while being unconscious, which is going to create more of an outcry of police brutality, because the argument's going to be, okay, well, you drugged Hampton. He was unconscious. He clearly was not a threat to law enforcement. Why was he shot twice in the head if he was unconscious? And so this is only going to continue to build the tension and the frustration within African American communities, and continuing to see rioting and racial violencing. Yeah, Miles, that's going to be an argument that a lot of people are going to make. Absolutely, that's just kind of a straight out, assassination at that point by law enforcement. And so, as you can see, quite a lot was going on in America in the 1960s. A lot of complicated, difficult events to try to process, and especially among older Americans who, again, are watching all of this on the television day after day after day. They're starting to think, what has happened to our country? This is not the America I grew up in, and say, the 1940s or the early 1950s. And so, especially for older Americans, they're starting to think, you know what? This is enough change. The country's changed too much. Right, exactly, Chad. I want things to go back to the good old days of the 1940s and the 1950s. Now, of course, we need to keep in mind that the 1940s and 1950s were not great for everyone, especially if you were a woman or a racial minority, for example. But amongst a certain group of Americans, there is going to be that desire of, I don't want any more change. I want things to be put under control. I want things to go back to how they were. And that's going to lead to a political shift that we'll talk about in future Class Connects. But I see we're unfortunately out of time, so we'll stop there. As always, if you have any questions, stick around. Happy to answer them. Otherwise, you're good to go. Hope you have a great day. I will see you back here tomorrow. Thanks, Andy. See ya. You too, Cadence. Bye. Thanks, Miles. See ya. And thanks for letting me know, Carson. Yep, it's a constantly ongoing process. See you, Chad. Thanks, Carson. You too.